All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to session 3 of the Woke Church versus the Gospel. Those watching online, thank you for following along. We hope that this is a blessing to you and your families as we walk through the entire Woke Church movement, the social justice movement, as it relates and impacts the gospel in our churches. Today's session, we're going to cover BLM. So I titled it BLM versus BLM, Black Lives Matter versus Black Lives Matter. Is there a way in which Christians can affirm Black Lives Matter? And does it need to be separate from the movement and the organization that we see in culture at large? I say yes. I think there has to be a differentiation. So we're going to look at some of the statements that BLM makes officially, their positions. We're going to look at some clips from comments their leaders have made, and we're going to contrast that with the Christian worldview. Again, at the outset, like we do each week, we have to remind ourselves that everything we are doing comes from a position of love and grace. To those who may be on the opposite side, to those who are in BLM, we want to communicate in love to you, never to offend, but to always give you the truth and grace. Because as Paul says, without love, we are nothing. So if this is the first time you're catching up with us here, we are in session 3. There's 8 altogether. We've already addressed what the Woke Church is, kind of a history of it. Last week was definitions. What are the words they're saying? What do they mean? This week is obviously BLM. Next week, are you woke on Sundays? Have you been impacted? Session 5 is kind of a continuation on that. Where's your identity? Is it in social justice or is it in Christ? 6, again, is a big picture. What is the gospel and what is social justice? We're going to wrap those together and look at them. Then session 7, what if you have family members who are inside this? How do you communicate to them? When does it become a gospel issue? And then session 8, we're going to wrap everything up. We're going to close it up. Okay, so at the outset, Black Lives Matter. Well, why does any life matter? What are the presuppositions behind BLM as a movement that would enable it to say Black Lives Matter? What ground does it stand on when it makes this claim? So really, you have two worldviews that collide here. You have BLM, which is a non-Christian, non-spiritual. It's a materialist, commonly Big Bang evolutionist. They're not spiritualists. Then you have the Christian worldview that says God created all things, man made directly in the image of God. So in either of these worldviews, how is it possible for Black lives to matter? What's the support, what's the foundation which you can stand on and say, Black lives absolutely do matter? So if what each worldview says about itself is true, then why? Why do they matter, or how can they matter? So again, we're going to examine and contrast the two worldviews specifically. And can we, again, just simply say Black Lives Matter in culture with the rest of our culture without any nuance or distinction? And will it carry and convey the same message? I contend very strongly you have to make a distinction. So we're going to look at BLM. So how could any life matter if life is truly random and just an accident? So if you are not a Christian and you're listening to this, your worldview foundation does not arise from the Bible. You don't hold that God created everything. You have a different position. So if you believe that we are products of evolution, that we're just cosmic accidents, then on what grounds do you have to say that any lives matter, let alone black lives or white lives or yellow lives or whatever life there is? If there is no God, and all there is matter and motion, we're just flying through space, you have planets, you have stars, you have jellyfish, you have all these things in creation, then why does life matter? If you want to look at the big picture, in that worldview, where there is no God, and you have just science, and you have materialism, and you have those concepts, well, scientists have determined that the universe ultimately will suffer a heat death. That's when all the energy in the entire universe gets so low that everything freezes and dies. The stars stop burning, the galaxies have unraveled, and the earth is gone. The certain end of creation itself is an icy destruction where life just stops. So with that being the foundation, why does life matter? What is the point of life then? Knowing that that's the end cause, all the efforts, all the struggle, all the things we're striving for in creation, to what end? It's ultimately just not going to matter. Again, if we are just highly randomly involved primates here by accident and gone tomorrow, then our lives in essence do not matter. How could they? There is no purpose for us being here. We are just here. There is no glorious end goal to our existence except that we exist and we are consciously aware of it and our surroundings. Foundationally, since BLM has rejected the Christian God who grants meaning to all life and has a plan for the universe and every single life in it, BLM cannot say, in fact, that any lives matter. All it can really do is make demands about things it wants for its members and the single race it promotes above all others. So you see, the claim Black Lives Matter from the context and the worldview, the position of BLM itself, is illogical and can't actually be made successfully upon objective examination. So let's look at some of the statements BLM says about itself. What are its goals? What it wants to accomplish? So these are taken right from BLM's website. So right at the top of the website, you're going to see this. Hashtag Black Lives Matter was founded in 2013 in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer. Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation Incorporated is a global organization in the US, UK, and Canada, whose mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. By combating and counteracting acts of violence, creating space for Black imagination and innovation, and centering Black joy, we are winning immediate improvements in our lives. So yes, we can agree as Christians with BLM, the movement, on one aspect, that killing Blacks is wrong and we should affirm their right to life as we would any race, as we are all made in the image of God. We have inherent value and dignity and worth. So our foundation is different, but we can agree on that aspect. They don't have a foundation to get to that. The second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself, and as much as we can, we ought to be doing that. So in principle, we have a point of contact with BLM where, yes, we can say Black Lives Matter, but as Christians, we say it for a different reason. Here's more from their website. We are expansive. We are a collective of liberators who believe in an inclusive and spacious movement. We also believe that in order to win and bring as many people along with us along the way, we must move beyond the narrow nationalism that is all too prevalent in Black communities. We must ensure we are building a movement that brings all of us to the forefront. That sounds good, right? Unity, bring people together, okay? We affirm the lives of Black queer and trans folk, disabled folks, undocumented folks, folks with records, women, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. Our network centers those who have been marginalized within the Black liberation movements. So right away, notice a distinction. They are distinguishing themselves from Black liberation theology. So even in Black liberation theology, from the BLM perspective, they marginalized what we would recognize as sexual sins, right? So Black liberation theology still held to a proper view of Christian sexual ethics, which BLM contradicts, as shown by the highlighted words here for the positions they advocate. BLM has no biblical moral foundation. This is why you see them affirming contrary sexual ethics to Christian orthodoxy. Notice they say gender spectrum. This is in direct contradiction to Christian theology. There are only two genders. God created two, and biology confirms that reality. This is pure Romans 1 rebellion to deny the clarity of the God-ordained created genders, male and female. To try to come up with others based on mental conditions and not physical science is not what we should be doing as Christians. The idea that the creature can say to its maker, no, I define what I am, is nothing but pure rebellion. Does the clay get to tell the potter? No, it doesn't. We are working for a world where Black lives are no longer systematically targeted for demise. We affirm our humanity, our contributions to this society, and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression. The call for Black lives to matter is a rallying cry for all Black lives, striving for liberation. Now again, we would agree with them that yes, if Blacks are being systematically targeted for demise, we would stand with them and say, no, we have to stop that, that's wrong. But we differentiate because they're created in the image of God. You have inherent worth and you have inherent dignity. Again, down here, deadly oppression. If there is deadly oppression going on, we would stand with them and say, no, we are against deadly oppression as Christians. So this is the position they take, and I find it interesting because they use the word systematically targeted and deadly oppression. Well, what about Planned Parenthood? It has recently been reported that more Black babies in New York City were aborted than born. It has also been confirmed that Planned Parenthood specifically sets up shop in predominantly Black areas to target them. The founder, Margaret Sanger, was an open racist who said she specifically created Planned Parenthood to systematically wipe out the black race. This isn't even up for debate. You can get her quotes. You can see her saying this stuff. The only black lives that don't matter are the unborn in this movement. Those black lives don't seem to matter. Here's a clip.
Lives matter or just some black lives? The black lives killed by black men matter, right? Yes? The black babies killed in the abortion clinics matter, right? Thought so. The black officers killed by that in Minnesota, that matters too, right? Okay. But the black babies that are killed in the abortion clinics don't matter, do they, medical people? Do their lives matter? Does the future of our black babies matter? Huh? What's up? What's up? Awful quiet now, aren't they? Uh-huh. It's okay if we kill them in the womb, right? But you have a problem when you don't seem to really have a problem when we kill them on the streets. Yes, when we know they're the same issue. If we don't respect the lives of our unborn children enough to save them and fight for them, our lives mean nothing once we're born.
So notice how silent they were when it came to abortion. Black lives matter. Yes, black lives matter. But when it came to the issue of the unborn black lives, confusion, silence. They will not stand up for the weakest, most vulnerable in our society, even if they're black. So notice how the mantra Black Lives Matter has limitations in the movement. It isn't just all Black Lives Matter, only specific ones according to BLM. And these are medical professionals, so think about it. We live in a point in human history where we have more information about what's going on in the womb than any other point in human history. We are without excuse. We know that these are our fellow human beings created in the image of God, and yet we have massive segments of our society that will not stand up for them and advocates for their destruction. Did you know BLM recently changed their About information? So what I gave to you earlier was their updated and revised About page. They had a previous page that was taken down because what they had on it was way too controversial. They were losing donors. It was not looking good. So let's look at what they used to have on their website and critique that. We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable. Notice the groupism here. This is a subject we've been addressing through the weeks as we go through this class. The focus is on groups, not the individuals. Now, what do they mean by we destroy the Western prescribed nuclear family structure? What was the Western world predominantly formed by? The Christian worldview. Don't let the words obscure what's being said by them here. They want to tear apart the classic mother, father, children family structure and advocate for replacing that formula with any other combination and call that good. You have an organization that is committed to destructive, contrary family makeups. They do not affirm that God decreed the family order, but instead rebel against that and put in its place other formations. You have to understand this very clearly. Can you as a Christian support the exact opposite of what God, your Redeemer, commands for the family? Are you loyal to your king when you support rebels against his rule and commands? These are questions each one of us must ask when we look at organizations that want our support. We are self-reflexive and do the work required to dismantle cisgender privilege and uplift black trans folk, especially black trans women, who continue to be disproportionately impacted by trans-antagonistic violence. There's a lot here. Dismantle cisgender privilege. If you don't know what cisgender means, that means your sexuality matches your assigned gender at birth. For example, I am a heterosexual male who is attracted to females. Basically, I am functioning properly as a man created by God to be attracted to women. This understanding of sexuality as the normal view, according to BLM, must be dismantled in our society. You can be any gender, attracted to any other gender, and that should be the normal understanding in our society. Do you see how this position is a direct contradiction to so much scripture about humans and proper sexual ethics? God created them male and female, and marriage is one woman and one man. That is the pinnacle of the created order's sexual ethics. This movement rejects this and rebels against God by saying it can define what sexual ethics should be. Forget what Scripture says, forget what God has revealed. We will determine, we will define. It further rebels against the created order by affirming gender changing. Trans women are men who are pretending to be women. Their biology hasn't changed. They are not a different gender. None of their DNA has changed. This is contrary to Scripture. This is a rebellion of, you see it in Romans 1. I don't like how I'm made. I'm going to define how I am, not God. God doesn't set the parameters for me as a creature. I will. I hope you see that this is rooted in just plain rebellion against God's authority as sovereign ruler to create and dictate what He wants the creation to be. We foster a queer-affirming network. When we gather, we do so with the intention of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, or rather the belief that all in the world are heterosexual, unless she, he, or they disclose otherwise. A queer-affirming network. Are Christians to affirm those who are in sin and encourage them to continue, or lovingly call them out? BLM encourages them to stay in it. We need to come alongside those who are trapped in these lifestyles and lovingly call them to repentance, call them to Christ. Heteronormative thinking. The idea that it's just normal for men to be attracted to women and a family is a man, woman, and some children. We must free ourselves as a society from the grip of this oppressive way of thinking. That's what BLM wants you to do. They would say it's normal for any type of sexual makeup in the family, and you cannot assume that people are heterosexual by default. Don't judge them until they reveal and identify to you what they are. So, let's pause for just a second. What does any of this on this slide or the previous slide have to do with the supposed unrelenting, systematic hunting down and killing of blacks by cops? Remember what the movement is for. Do you see how this entire movement is much more than just one social cause? This is an entire worldview. It deals with economics, sexual ethics, human identity. We're not just talking about people being killed by the government disproportionately to other races. We practice empathy. We encourage comrades with the intent to learn about and connect with their contexts. Ah, comrades. Who historically has utilized this word? This comes not from the Christian worldview, nor from free market capitalism. You don't get it there. This comes from socialist, communist, Marxist worldviews and nations. And this is part of the BLM message. How does all that we have heard so far from BLM comport with Christianity? Or even the type of nation those who, for the most part, adhere to the Christian worldview founded? BLM is fundamentally different and contrary in its system and its ethics and its worldview, not just with respect to Christianity, but as the country we live in as a whole. It's a whole different way of thinking. So what is some of the messaging we have seen in culture? How does that line up with the facts, the statistics, the data that's tracked? Right? So we see violence, we see rioting, we see looting. You have people who say Black Lives Matter, but then go and loot businesses of fellow blacks, rob stores and burn down buildings in their own black communities. You have people who are looting stores in cities on the other side of the nation in response to somebody who was killed 1,500 miles away. Did those business owners and neighbors deserve to have their livelihood destroyed by random people because a person who they had no contact with was tragically killed? Is this true biblical justice? Are these actions things that Christians can coalesce around? Can we affirm violence and destruction of property? No, of course not. Not unless there is tyranny as defined by the Bible. But what is that which we have in this nation? Do we actually have the government hunting down specifically one race? What are the statistics for police shootings by race? Is there a massive disproportionate number of blacks killed by cops compared to Asians or whites in this country? Let's take a look. So BLM has been criticized for its Marxist language. A video surfaced of a BLM co-founder openly saying leaders of the group were trained Marxists. So understand that the worldview that they hold, even though they took it off their page, doesn't mean it's changed. They're just obscuring it from the public. You think they're going to give up their worldview? So here are words from BLM leaders themselves. Let's see how they comport with a Christian worldview. Let's look at what they're saying and what they're advocating for, and can we as Christians get behind that and go, yes, solidarity.
We actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. we are trained Marxists.
If this country doesn't give us what we want, then we will burn down this system and replace it, all right? And I could be speaking
That man right there is the president of
figuratively.
BLM
I could be
for all
speaking
of New York,
literally. It's
just
a
so you're aware
matter
of who
of
he is.
interpretation.
If somebody decides to loot a Gucci or a Macy's or a Nike, because that makes sure that that person eats. That makes sure that that person has clothes. That's reparations. That is reparations. Anything they want to take it, because these businesses have insurance. They're going to get their money back. My people aren't getting anything. Our community can hold its own without the police. We can take out the trash on our own.
If you kill one of ours, it's time for us to kill one of yours.
So there's much more to this video, but it's not playing. Okay. So BLM advocates for violence, theft, and sinful behaviors. This is not loving your neighbor to steal goods from their store or take vengeance into your own hands, right? This is an obvious violation of Christian ethics. Trained Marxists, not Christian. The leaders of BLM are trained Marxists. You have to understand that. They've even said that. These are two radically different worldviews. They see the world completely different. Marxism is a struggle between the proletariat and the rich, the working class and the rich, oppressed, oppressors. This is why you see it fit in so well with black liberation theology and social justice. Do you see here how the connections are made between these groups and how it's coming into the church, right? You take the vehicle of oppression and Marxism and you slap onto it some theological terms and you bring that into the church. It's a whole different paradigm and lens through looking. As Christians, again, are we to take vengeance ourselves and retribution and kill our neighbors? No. We're to appeal to the state, which is ordained by God to wield the sword against the wicked and evil in society. BLM focuses on power and inequality and working to ensure everybody has equal outcomes. Now notice I said the word outcomes, not opportunity. This is a very different way of thinking. They believe at the core freedom is a root evil which has resulted in class inequality. Therefore, justice is to provide equality in outcomes. One example is economic. All doctors should be paid the same. All teachers should be paid the same. All equal outcomes based on your profession class. Don't worry about skill or experience. None of that matters. If somebody who does the same job as you is paid more than you, that's unjust. That's evil, according to BLM. So we are told police are inherently racist, right? Implicit bias, stuff that we covered in previous sections, and that they are aggressively targeting blacks and killing them in our communities and in our country. Is that actually true? So this video from PragerU does an excellent job of breaking down the statistical data. When you pull together all the data from the police departments nationwide, what's the picture? What are we seeing?
Does the truth matter? Not to groups like Black Lives Matter. That's tragic for many reasons, not the least of which is that Black lives are being lost as a result. When it comes to the subject of American police, blacks, and the deadly use of force, here is what we know. A recent deadly force study by Washington State University researcher Lois James found that police officers were less likely to shoot unarmed black suspects than unarmed white or Hispanic ones in simulated threat scenarios. Harvard economics professor Roland Fryer analyzed more than 1,000 officer-involved shootings across the country. He concluded that there is zero evidence of racial bias in police shootings. In Houston, he found that blacks were 24% less likely than whites to be shot by officers, even though the suspects were armed or violent. Does the truth matter? An analysis of the Washington Post's police shooting database and of federal crime statistics reveals that fully 12% of all whites and Hispanics who die of homicide are killed by cops. By contrast, only 4% of black homicide victims are killed by cops. But isn't it a sign of bias that blacks make up 26% of police shooting victims, but only 13% of the national population? It is not, and common sense suggests why. Police shootings occur more frequently where officers confront armed or violently resisting suspects. Those suspects are disproportionately black. According to the most recent study by the Department of Justice, Although blacks were only about 15% of the population in the 75 largest counties in the U.S., they were charged with 62% of all robberies, 57% of murders, and 45% of assaults. In New York City, blacks commit over 3/4 of all shootings, though they are only 23% of the city's population. Whites, by contrast, commit under 2% of all shootings in the city, though they are 34% of the population. New York's crime disparities are repeated in virtually every racially diverse city in America. The real problem facing inner-city black communities today is not the police, but criminals. In 2014, over 6,000 blacks were murdered, more than all white and Hispanic homicide victims combined. Who is killing them? Not the police and not white civilians, but other blacks. In fact, a police officer is 18.5 times more likely to be killed by a black male than an unarmed black male is to be killed by a police officer. If the police ended all use of lethal force tomorrow, it would have a negligible impact on the black death by homicide rate. In Chicago, through just the first 6.5 months of 2016, over 2,300 people were shot. That's a shooting an hour during some weekends. The vast majority of the victims were black. During the same period, the Chicago police shot 12 people, all armed and dangerous. That's 0.5% of all shootings. Does the truth matter? If it does, here's a truth worth pondering. There is no government agency more dedicated to the proposition that Black lives matter than the police. The proactive policing revolution that began in the mid-1990s has dramatically brought down the inner-city murder rate and saved tens of thousands of black lives. Unfortunately, that crime decline is now in jeopardy. As I write in my book, The War on Cops, police officers are backing off of proactive policing in black neighborhoods thanks to the false narrative that police officers are infected with homicidal bias. As a result, violent crime is going up. In cities with large black populations, homicides in 2015 rose anywhere from 54% in Washington, D.C. to 90% in Cleveland. Overall, in the nation's 56 largest cities, homicides in 2015 rose 17%, a nearly unprecedented one-year spike. Many law-abiding residents of high-crime areas beg the police to maintain order, precisely the type of policing that the ACLU, progressive politicians, and the Obama Justice Department denounce as racist. This is tragic because when the police refrain from proactive policing, black lives are lost. Lost because of a myth. The best research and data reach this conclusion. There is no evidence that police are killing blacks just because they're black. You now have the truth. Does it matter?
To subscribe to it.
So PragerU just is very helpful. They have a lot of little clips with a lot of information on these issues, and if you want to explore a little bit more, go check them out. I recommend them. Now, in this video, you gotta contrast what was just said here to what the messages we're hearing in culture. How can you have two completely contrary messages? Well, I would argue one of them is focused on an emotional aspect while ignoring the statistical, factual aspect. Christians being rolled up in this movement. Well, you have people and Christians who are compassionate. We love our neighbor. We want to care for the neighbor. So we hear these things about injustice and we want to get involved, but we have to know what we're getting involved with. We have to pay attention. God has not called us to be emotional beings. We have a rational intellect, and we're to use that and to go out and serve Him. Here's another clip. So this one is helpful because it really highlights, is BLM actually helping the black community? Is the focus of the group on police shootings and destroying the biblical understanding of the family helping the black community in this country? So again, contrast this, what you see in these clips, with the Christian worldview. What are you seeing? Is it beneficial? Is it something we should be connected with?
They have no facts. They don't do any research. They don't do any type of higher learning when it comes to what they believe. All they know is what the media narrative tells them to believe, and that's all they parrot.
The organization is fake. I personally believe that the BLM movement is fake. It has nothing to do with advancing the lives of black people.
They actually say they want to break up the family home.
Exactly.
Their main goal is to break up the patriarchal nuclear family. They want the men removed out of the family, which is what Democrats want also.
Exactly.
If BLM really cared about black lives, why would it be solely isolated to incidents where a black life is taken at the hands of a white cop? That happens less than 1%.
Come on.
Now, wait. Now, I like to equate this to, it's the same as if I was in a horrific accident. I have a massive head wound, I have a leg fracture and a scratch on my finger. And here come the first responders and they want to tend to the scratch on my finger. And I'm telling you, what about the wound on my head? What about my fractured leg?
Come on.
That's what the BLM movement is. They're tending to the scratch on my finger, and that's not even what it's about. If you want to help us, let us tell you how you can help us.
Yes.
Don't come in and tell us how you want to help us, and don't tell me that I'm oppressed, because I'm not oppressed. I'm a black American. I'm a proud black American. I'm not oppressed. I'm not oppressed. I'm one of the freest persons on this world.
Kneel for no man. I only kneel to God.
As you can see,
no one has a privilege over me except for God.
As you can see, black conservatism is the new punk rock. If you know what I mean.
Yeah. We're the rebels. You want to be cool? Come join our cause, baby.
What are the 5 biggest issues facing blacks in America? Here's my list. Problem number 5, the victim mentality. Nothing holds someone back more than seeing himself as a victim. Why? Because a victim is not responsible for his situation. Everything is someone else's fault. And the victim sees little chance of improving his life. How can he get ahead if someone is holding him back? All this makes the victim unhappy, frustrated, and angry. This is how too many blacks see themselves, as victims. So much so that their victim status becomes their primary identity and their ruling ideology. I call it victimology. Unfortunately, many black churches preach this victimology. Many black parents pass it on to their children, inner city schools teach it to their students, and the black media reinforce it. Meanwhile, the NAACP and other black grievance groups fundraise on it. Problem number 4, lack of diversity. Blacks repeatedly demand an honest dialogue or debate about race. But how can there ever be an honest dialogue about race between blacks and whites when there is virtually no honest dialogue between blacks and blacks? It's hypocritical. And if a black doesn't think whites are ultimately responsible for black people's problems, they're labeled a sellout, Uncle Tom, or race traitor. As long as this type of groupthink exists, race reverence of the Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson type will continue to be celebrated, while independent black thinkers such as Professors Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams will be shunned. The honest race dialogue and debate that first has to happen is not between blacks and whites, but between blacks and blacks. We demand diversity from others, but need to practice it ourselves where it really matters, in thought, opinion, and even political affiliation. Problem number 3, urban terrorism. As just about everyone knows, but too few talk about publicly, in majority black cities, violent black-on-black crime is rampant. A Department of Justice study from 1980 through 2008 revealed that blacks accounted for almost half of the nation's homicide victims, 47.4%, and more than half of the offenders, 52.4%, all while being 13% of America's population. The Tuskegee Institute conducted a study of all known lynchings of blacks that occurred between 1882 through 1968. During this 86-year span, which is essentially the post-Civil War era up to the Civil Rights era, 3,446 blacks were reportedly lynched. Presently, black-on-black murder eclipses the number of blacks lynched over the course of 80 years, roughly every 6 months. Unbelievably, the culpability for this disproportionate amount of mayhem actually lies with a menacing 2 to 3% minority within the black populace. I call them urban terrorists. And since they're literally spawned from problem number 2, the black community protects them. Problem number 2, proliferation of baby mamas. The disintegration of the nuclear family has led to an astronomical increase of single mother households. According to the Moynihan Report, in 1965, nearly 25% of black children were born to unwed mothers. The report's author, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, said this was a disaster in the making. He was, of course, vilified by so-called black leaders and their progressive allies. But he was right. Today, the out-of-wedlock birth rate is nearly 75% and even higher in some urban areas. To be clear, baby daddies share this responsibility with baby mamas. Yet, while baby daddies are blamed and rarely shown compassion, baby mamas are rarely blamed and receive both compassion and support. This lopsided dynamic and the previously listed pathologies stem directly from the number one problem facing the Black community. Problem number one, unquestioning allegiance to so-called progressive policies. Unwavering loyalty to progressive liberal policies is the primary reason these dire conditions persist. It both makes them possible and perpetuates them. It's no coincidence that progressivism is the common thread that binds predominantly Black cities where single-parent homes, failing schools, rampant poverty, and crime predominate. Look at cities like Detroit, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. They've been run by progressive Democrats for decades. If their liberal policies were at all effective, these cities should have become models of economic growth and prosperity. Instead, they're models of dysfunction. By fostering and exploiting the victim mentality, discouraging self-examination, subsidizing baby mamas, and making excuses for Black thugs, so-called progressive policies don't alleviate the problems that afflict the Black community. They aggravate those problems. You may have noticed that racism did not make the list. Why not? It's simple. There will be no solution to the problems afflicting Black America until more Blacks recognize that the issues plaguing our community are ultimately self-inflicted. Does racism exist? Sure, but there are other problems far more serious. And waiting until there are no more races will mean waiting and making excuses forever. I'm Talib Starks for Prager University.
So obviously as Christians, we would disagree a little bit with Talib there. The core issue is obviously a spiritual issue. And unless God sheds his grace on people and they're spiritually reborn, we know the scriptures say that men love darkness rather than light. They will seek out all forms of destruction. These two video clips I feel are very helpful, helping illustrate what is the real information, the real facts on the ground, as people say. Because you have BLM putting out a narrative, break up the family, defund the police, all of these things. But when you look at what happens when you do those things, it's ultimately destructive. BLM's focus and BLM's intent is to get you to live a life and to focus on things that are antithetical to Christianity. Don't have your family the way God says to have your family. Don't have civil government set up the way that God says to have civil government set up. BLM is proposing things that are very contrary to our faith. So what is the Christian worldview? So Christianity focuses on personal responsibility, right? We will all give an account for our actions. This goes against groupism that this woke social justice movement exhorts, and hopefully you've been realizing this these past 3 weeks. You've been seeing this contrast we've been trying to make. Your rewards in this life, your outcome, since this movement's all focused on outcome, scripturally is based upon what you are and what you decide to do. Paul very clearly says if a man is not willing to work, he should not eat, 2 Thessalonians 3:10. There is a focus on personal action, and it has a direct result on outcome. Nowhere in the Bible does it teach we Christians are to be focused on achieving equal outcomes. It is God who makes the rich and the poor. It is God who makes the famous and the unknown. It is God who makes the dumb and the mute. Christians are called to be faithful to the life God has assigned them for each one of us, no matter our station in life. 1 Corinthians 7:17. Your talents and skills in this life come from the natural giftedness God has granted each of you. You are to exercise those skills and talents for God's glory. Therefore, some who are more gifted in this life will achieve more. It is nothing but sin and envy and covetousness to suggest that those who are highly gifted should not be allowed to prosper as God has decreed. To say that everybody must be restricted to the same outcome is to usurp the very God who made some stars shine brighter than others and some birds more beautiful than others. Beauty and splendor in creation exist because God has created it that way. BLM seeks to compress God's creative acts by becoming God itself and setting boundaries on man that only God has the right to do. All lives matter because all lives exist in God's image. So as a Christian, you can say Black Lives Matter because every single Black life was created by God in the image of God for God. There is a purpose behind every life, and we must value all life and protect all the images of God, of all colors and ethnicities, for God created them all in his sovereign decree for his glory. So we'll close with this. Proverbs 28:21. To show partiality is not good, but for a piece of bread a man will do wrong. So with BLM, you see looting, you see riots, you see Marxist ideology. Do the things you have seen and heard line up with Scripture? I would contend no, they do not. Private property is established in the Bible. Commands against stealing, for example. But that doesn't exist for BLM. Just go and take it. Get your justice. The family order is established by God, but BLM seeks to dismantle that. Proper human sexuality and gender is defined by God, but BLM advocates for perversity in sexual ethics and gender, rebelling against God's right to make the clay into whatever the triune God has decreed. Christians who follow the one who is the truth should care about the truth. BLM ignores factual, verifiable truths about economics, biology, crime statistics in order to push social narratives. Christians cannot simply say Black Lives Matter like the culture does. We must declare Black Lives Matter because God created them in his image and likeness, and therefore they have inherent value, dignity, and worth.